Hi, I'm Nathan Elwood, and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about the origins of horror and thriller fiction. People love to be scared. They love to feel their blood race and their hearts pound. It's a pure, elemental feeling, so it's no wonder that we can see the roots of horror and thriller fiction going back to the beginnings of storytelling. Beowulf and Odysseus both had their monsters. Grendel and the Cyclops menaced from caves and from shadows, threatening terrible fates for our heroes. Haunted house stories and other tales of ghouls and goblins can be traced all the way back to Greek writer Pliny the Younger, circa 50 AD. And Western folklore is replete with stories of suspense, terror, and monsters, like Little Red Riding Hood's wolf or Russian folklore's Baba Yaga. Modern novelistic horror, however, didn't really get its start until around the 1800s, around the same time that the detective genre was beginning to take shape. In fact, the roots of what we now think of as the horror genre can likely be traced to one group of individuals locked together in a stately Gothic mansion. It was June 1816, the year that later became known as the Year Without a Summer. Volcanic eruptions in Indonesia had plunged North America and Europe into a volcanic winter, decimating crops and replacing the usual temperate and sunny weather with a cold, dreary gray. It was during this dark, oppressive summer that the poet Lord Byron invited a group of friends to stay with him at the Villa Diodati near Lake Geneva, Switzerland. Unable to enjoy their usual summer activities, the group took to telling each other scary stories, competing to see who could invent the most hair-raising tale. Lord Byron and his friend John Polidori put forth an excellent effort. Together, they created the vampire, which invented the idea of the romantic vampire. But even these masters saw their work upstage. The real star of the hour was 18-year-old Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. Mary had come to the villa with her boyfriend, the poet Percy Shelley, and found herself inspired by a waking nightmare during her stay. That summer, the future Mary Shelley created Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, thereby kickstarting both the horror and science fiction genres. Both works were enormous successes. The Vampire set off a vampire craze throughout Europe that would eventually see publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Its Byronic hero, the vampire Lord Ruthven, also became a staple of the thriller genre. Alexander Dumas would later model his Count of Monte Cristo after the character, and salute him in the novel. Frankenstein is, of course, one of the most well-known and popular horror stories ever written. It has inspired countless imitators, such as The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and was possibly the first horror story ever put to film, with the 1910 production by the American Edison Studios. And while it was in Europe that horror was born, it was in America that it learned how to crawl and slither and creep. Edgar Allan Poe, along with essentially inventing the detective story, can largely be credited with the evolution of both the horror and thriller genres. While Frankenstein, the vampire, and other tales of the time built up the archetypes that we continue to see in horror fiction to this day, they weren't, well, all that scary. The same could not be said of Poe. His tales of the supernatural and the macabre, like The Black Cat and The Fall of the House of Usher, captivated audiences, and still terrify to this day. Other tales, like The Pit and the Pendulum, used the same build of suspense and dread to draw in readers, but by sparing the hero at the end, Poe inadvertently began the divide between the two genres of horror and thriller. Poe's success generated countless imitators. Some of these included notable writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Jules Verne, but the majority of them were cheap, disposable fiction that we now call penny dreadfuls. In the early 20th century, the penny dreadfuls evolved into the pulps. It was from the pulps that we see the next stage in the evolution of both the horror and thriller genre. For horror, the big innovation was the cosmic horror of H.P. Lovecraft and his Lovecraft Circle of fellow writers, which expanded horror from direct, visible threats to include a sense of existential terror as well. Other pulp stories of this time cemented the tropes of the thriller genre. Stories of weird heroes like The Shadow, or spy novels like The 39 Steps, utilized the same suspenseful techniques pioneered by horror, but gave readers a victorious hero and a rescued damsel at the end of the story as payoff. By the 1950s, the genres had mostly cemented themselves into the forms we know today. The thriller became typified by stories of spies and criminals that preyed upon the fears and paranoias of the time. This type of story was advanced by writers like John le Carre and Ian Fleming, and filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock. Horror continued to delve into monsters, murderers, and the macabre. It was in this decade that pulp writer Richard Matheson released I Am Legend, a story about the last man on Earth defending against hordes of vicious nocturnal monsters. In some ways, this story took horror back to its roots. Its vampiric monsters called back to Byron and Polidori, and the idea of the last man on Earth actually goes back to none other than Mary Shelley in a book she wrote with that very title. But it also advanced horror forward. Its story of a siege by undead monsters would be appropriated by director George Romero only a few years later for his Night of the Living Dead, the film which began one of horror's most enduring and popular genres, the zombie story. Today, horror and thriller fiction is some of the most popular published work. Writers like Stephen King, Clive Barker, and Thomas Harris continue to dominate shelves and to keep us up long past our bedtimes. All because, well, we like to be scared.